webcast. As you might notice, this is a little bit of a different format. So we'd love feedback from you. So feedback or questions can easily be put in chat. As always, this is going to be about a half hour, 40 minutes, depending on the amount of questions and how talkative the two of us are. It's a topic we feel pretty passionate about. So
assessments for hiring. If you follow the thought leaders, good to great. It all begins with the right hire, and the assessment is what helps for making that right hire. We're joined here by Ingrid. She is kind of manning the booth here. She's going to be the one fielding the booth. She's going to be the one fielding any questions that you would have in chat, and helping us with the technology as we're working our way through this.
Yeah, so seriously, it's obviously the first time. It is not going to be perfect. So, but give us your feedback. Tell us if you like this a little bit better or not, what you like and don't, and we'll try to tweak it again for next time.
And Ingrid's going to put into the chat a link that will take you to the form that allow you to give us some feedback, and also be able to download a checklist for whether or not your hiring process is complete.
Yeah, so here we are for X-ray vision for hiring. We've always said that assessments are not a process. You need a process, but using assessments within the process helps you figure out where to direct the course of your process along the way.
John and Cindy Gabe, I don't know if you heard it.
Oh, yeah,
we're both marital and business partners, and we kind of put these webinars on every month together.
Yes.
So
why this webcast?
So we're all human, and humans have biases that we cannot necessarily isolate. And when we're evaluating candidates, it's really difficult to understand the whole person just through the conversations that we have during the interviewing process and reference checking. So we think that the assessments that are used during the hiring process gives the hiring team insights that they wouldn't normally get by just doing interviews in traditional conversation.
And you'll hear us talk about the selection process a lot and where to insert the assessments. An assessment is not a process. A single interview isn't a process. We all know these days most people can pull off a single interview. It's kind of like being able to pull off a speed date. One and done is a piece of cake. But how someone does in each step of the process, how gracefully they move through the whole thing, is critical, even when it comes to the assessments. What's the turnaround time? How long did it take them? What's their reaction to it? Any of those things are things to keep in mind. One of the reasons it's becoming far more critical is people are getting a lot better at interviewing. And the cost of bad hires is more significant with the labor market being what it is. People can jump jobs very, very easily. But we don't have the number of people available where you can't just go hire high level of talent at the drop of a hat. So you have to bring people in, you have to develop them. There's a lot more upfront investment, and it's a lot like sports. I mean, you get these freshman athletes that you're spending more time grooming, getting them up to speed, and before they get to their sophomore year, that somebody else dangles a little more NIL money in front of them and they're off to the races. And so that upfront investment can feel that much more draining. We're not saying to stop that. You really need to, but let's make sure you're getting the right people on board to begin with.
And the assessments are a great way to help make those decisions.
So we've been around assessments for, let's just say, decades. And we've seen some good ones and some bad ones. We've seen some good ones used poorly and some bad ones used well. So we thought a better understanding of hiring assessments, the tools themselves, as well as how to use them, was really the inspiration for this webcast. A little bit about us.
So we started in metropolitan Detroit in 1996 and migrated our way down into Charlotte in 2007. We've got a presence in both cities and do work all throughout the country in both selection, helping organizations make better hires, and in acceleration, helping their leaders grow and get the most out of their team.
And if you want to learn more about the Leadership Academy and everything that's in that, feel free to check out the website for a lot more detail.
So we like to think of a hiring assessment similar to the diagnostic a physician would run on a patient who has some ailment. And if it's a good physician, they're going to evaluate that ailment with many different tools. They might use an X-ray, they may use an MRI, they might use a thermometer, they might use a stethoscope. All those different tools a physician uses to evaluate the patient. We think the same thing is true with hiring managers and evaluating candidates. Use a variety of tools to evaluate the whole person.
Yeah, when we started using these, originally just behavior assessments were out there. That is somebody an extrovert or an introvert? Are they an analytic or creative? And that was enough until after a while, you'd realize laying out a couple of candidates or employees who have the same profile, and you go, I know these three are supposed to be the same, but I'm telling you, there's something wildly different about them, and you can't figure it out. And this is one of my soapbox moments because I become incensed by consultants who use a single science and believe that one science, that one tool can cure cancer. It cannot cover everything. It can only tell you about behaviors. You can't infer motivators off of a behavioral assessment. You can't infer other things. I've heard people say, well, I like this simple assessment because it's easy to read. Okay, a digital thermometer is easy to read. It's still not going to tell you if you have a broken arm or if you need surgery for it. So you would need, maybe it tells you if there's an infection, but you still need that X-ray. You need the MRI to see if there's soft tissue damage. Can we just put it in a sling for 3 weeks? Or do we need surgery and then physical therapy? Like, what's going on? And unless you have multiple sciences giving you that insight, you cannot make the right decision. And there are too many consultants. I had one tell me from a behavioral assessment that I was inspired to be with people. Now, those of you who know me well enough would know that's not quite true. I am really good at aligning talent. My motivation comes from being inspired to help for-profit organizations accomplish their goals by aligning their talent to get there. I'm really good at understanding people, how to get more out of them, how to motivate them. But if I have downtime, I am not going to the mall to people watch. So
So we're going to talk a little bit more about what all that consists of. So why use them in hiring? In the old days, we used to look at the resume and within 30 seconds make our decision whether or not this was a candidate we wanted to pursue. Then we would interview, and then within, what is it?
Within 3 minutes, most hiring people will make their go, no-go decision within the first 3 minutes if they don't have a decent selection process. Now, they'll keep interviewing, but they will have made up their mind, and now they're just asking questions to confirm the decision they already made 3 minutes into the interview.
Right. So again, we want to use the assessment to help de-bias our decision, to help us be a little bit more objective. It's best if your assessment has a job fit component to it, and you can then compare a candidate's results to what you want in the role and see what type of fit you have there.
Yeah, we were introduced some time ago to Brad Smart's top grading, and we really like it a lot. We love the discipline it teaches hiring teams in asking the questions. However, it prescribes that every candidate for every job should be asked the same questions. Well, unless you are a behavior expert, you don't understand the difference in the answers you should be listening for a programmer versus an accountant, or a programmer versus a lead programmer, or versus a receptionist. So unless you are exceptional, so assessments, to John's point, that start with what does the job need, and then drives you to make sure you are measuring for and asking the questions that drive you to the same job fit in the person, is going to help you. Now, the other thing is when you're using multiple sciences, nobody's perfect, but we all know humans aren't perfect. So this allows us to go in eyes wide open and understand where somebody's going to need some support.
And one of the key points that you want to consider when you're looking at an assessment, there is no good or bad assessment result.
Right.
There's a good or bad job fit. All right, so it's really the fit that you're evaluating, not necessarily the result of the assessment. We'll talk a little bit more about different types of results. One of as we were putting doing some of the research for this role or for this webcast, I was curious at how the usage of assessments have changed over the last 10 years. And I was shocked at how different we use assessments in the hiring process today than just as little as 10 years ago. Today, almost 80%, almost 4 out of 5 organizations use some sort of assessment in their hiring process versus only 26% 10 years ago. That just, we're using 3 times more assessments today than we were just 10 years ago. So what that means is candidates are much more comfortable and they're going to be expecting the assessments in the hiring process.
And certainly accepting it as one of the steps. It is key to make sure you're explaining how you intend to use them so that good assessments help you shine a light on areas where both of you need more conversation to decide if this is a good fit or not. The last thing you want to do is set somebody up for failure or to pull them away from a job in which they're wildly successful to come to your position where they fail. And so being able to evaluate that for both perspectives is really helpful.
The other interesting movement nowadays is the shift towards a multi-science application. And we talked a little bit about the value of that as in our X-ray example. But over the 10-year period, we have shifted from a single science to more of a multi-science application in the assessment.
And I would say it's especially funny when I think about when we first came down to Charlotte, 19 years ago, we met some folks who, were grappling for other ways to get some insight into candidates. And I remember one using a handwriting analysis, somebody else using some other bizarro tools that were hard to say were job related, that you could say how much a job fit there was. But now things have come so far in such a short period of time. We're going to be saying that a lot about AI in about a year.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only they're getting better to the assessment. So. Couple of things, or many things that you should understand as you're choosing your assessment. The government has some guidelines and some requirements that you want to keep in mind. You want to make sure that it is compliant with the regulations. You want to make sure that it does have the adverse impact accommodations. You want to make sure that it does have some connection to the job and that you make some accommodations for all candidates to be able to take it. You want to make sure that your candidates understand that the assessment is how it's going to be used. And most importantly, you want to make sure you have a valid, reliable assessment that has been approved by, I don't know what government agency does that, but some maybe the EEOC.
The EEOC and OFCCP have different regs too.
Right. So as you're shopping assessments, make sure from your assessment supplier, you ask for their compliance information and make sure you have that on hand.
Yeah, you specifically want to ask for their reliability and validity testing. Good news, you are not expected to evaluate how good their testing was. And some of it is not very good. Just the fact that you asked for it and they provided it. It's up to them to run the test, so you don't have to be that expert. One big thing on the reasonable accommodation. With many learning disabilities being discovered these days, one of the primary accommodations being afforded to people in your workplace is that there is not a time constraint on assessments that they're taking. The key here to understand is no one needs to tell you about an accommodation that's needed until 90 days, up to 90 days after they're hired. So if you inadvertently give a timed test or timed assessment to someone who requires additional time and you don't know it, it could be considered discriminatory against them. So we just generally say, just try to find assessments or tests that do not have a time requirement. You can still look at the time it took somebody to take it and see if it falls in a normal range, and if not, have conversations about, my gosh, we did have one person with, say, 3 different assessments in the trimetrics. One usually takes 6 to 8 minutes. It took this one person 75 minutes to complete that one part of the trigonometrics. So I was like, something's off. Eventually, she admitted she kept going onto the internet to try to figure out what we were looking for and to try to figure out how to answer the questions. At least she was honest. But she did that throughout, so that's something to keep in mind.
The one common assessment out there is the Wonderlic cognitive test. It is a time test. You have 12 minutes to answer as many of these questions as you can on this test, and that ends up being your score. That could be a problem if your candidate has a learning disability. So that's a very, very common
Just
assessment.
doesn't test well when they know
Right.
it's time.
But anyway, that
Yes.
could be one. And a couple of other points to keep in mind. You do need to record and keep track of all the candidates' results, and you want to make sure they're confidential.
Oh,
So
yeah,
you
please
don't
don't
wanna
put them, yeah, keep them confidential.
So two key components of an assessment that you want to make sure you've researched: validity and reliability. Validity is whether or not the assessment measures what it is designed to measure. And that could be anything in human behavior. If an assessment is intended to measure a human's motivational makeup, a valid assessment will give you results that reflect a human's motivational makeup. All right. All too often, assessments will claim to measure one thing, but eventually report on another aspect of personality. That is not a valid assessment. Reliability means it's repeatable. It means that the likelihood of somebody taking the assessment multiple times is going to have a similar result. If it's a poorly designed assessment and somebody takes it multiple times and has wildly different results, that's not a very reliable instrument.
So this is the most boring part of the whole webcast and anything about assessments. You got to make sure they're valid and reliable. Other than that, move along.
Yeah, just make sure your assessment provider has that for you. So we talked a little bit before about the value of a multi-science assessment and how, just like a physician, you need multiple ways of evaluating the human. The same is true when you're talking about psychometrics. There are lots of different makeups to the human personality. We tend to focus on the behavior, the motivational makeup as it pertains to what drives them at work. We like to look at EQ or some sort of personal skill makeup. And then we also like to look at a fourth component, a cognitive component. There are lots of different types of instruments. This is one that we like because of the different components of the human that we look at.
If you can step back for a second just so they can see. So in one page of the assessment results, we'll show that the behaviors piece. So that this is the most common part. Most of the assessments out there, Predictive Index, DISC, Culture Index, McQuaig, Haig, OAD, Cosmo, most of them are going to give you behavior assessments and how you're naturally wired to behave and adapted. The motivators is based on Edward Spranger's work. So it's a completely different science, and the personal skills are measured through the science of axiology, which was Dr. Robert Hartman's work. So these are giving you different pieces, and then in the critical thinking, we use the Watson-Glaser. I get nervous when people start talking about IQ assessments beyond second grade. And the problem is the IQ is supposed to measure, we're back to validation and reliability, measure the difference between one's capacity to learn and know, or the capacity to know beyond what they've learned in school. So by the time you get to second grade or beyond, it's impossible to understand what their raw intelligence is versus what they've learned to do. And so IQ tests, or people who promote to be able to do IQ tests beyond second grade, become a little sketchy. It's the reason we focus on critical thinking ability. What's the ability of somebody's capacity to understand the situation, what's meant, not just what's said, the strength of arguments without their own biases coming into play, and their ability to make the correct decisions. That's what we want to know in the workplace. That's what's really helpful. What their raw intelligence capacity was when they were an infant is kind of irrelevant at this
But
point.
again, it all has to be job fit as well.
Right.
So to the extent IQ fits a job, you may not.
You know, I have to tell you, my very first certification was in Predictive Index. And I could not imagine how we interviewed before this because, we were guessing. I mean, sure, I got to know things a little bit better because of how people failed in certain jobs before, and I tried to avoid those. But I thought when we were given that behavior assessment, this thing was like magic. Like, how did we ever interview before this? And over time, I realized that wasn't enough. When I realized there were too many similarities between people, I could visually and personally see that were different. And then we layered on the workplace motivators. We're like, oh, the light bulb went on even greater. And it was so amazing. And so as you layer on more information, sure, it's more for you to learn, but the insight it gives you is just phenomenally greater.
One of the things that you want to keep in mind as you're looking at different types of assessments that you want to provide to your candidates is what the experience is going to be for them. Different levels of jobs are going to have different experiences for the candidates. We like to keep our candidates' time investment in the assessment to be less than an hour. But you want to be considerate of your candidates and not over-assess them. You don't maybe not want to under-assess them, but keep in mind how long you're going to expect it to take for them. You're going to want to let them know as they're beginning to start the assessment process how much time to carve out so that they can dedicate it. But you don't want to eliminate strong candidates through assessment fatigue.
Right. And just think about it yourself. How many of your vendors or merchants want you to take a survey about how great your experience was at your doctor's office? And, you're like, okay, I'm in. And you start answering questions, and eventually you're like, how freaking long is this survey? And you're looking for some clue as to how far you've gone. And so we need to give them a little bit of a heads up. Some of the executive assessments, if you'll call it that, can last up to 3 days of in-house with actors hired and going through role plays and as well as traditional assessments or critical thinking tests, and then meeting with licensed psychologists. I mean, that's just draining. And when you think about what the job market's like and how people can make other choices, it needs to be comprehensive, but it also does need to consider the candidate experience.
So there's a couple of things to keep in mind in terms of best practices. It should be used as a part of a process. It isn't a go, no go. We recommend that our clients assess after the first interview. We think that sometimes the assessment can bias the interview, so we like the interview to take place before they've seen some results. It may vary depending on the organization's assessment process and the instruments that they're using, where they might drop it in. We would recommend that you have an interpretation by an expert. At some point, organizations and hiring teams can develop their own expertise, but some of these assessments can be very difficult to understand, and having that expert help them interpret it is important. We talked a little bit about the assessment being tied back to the job requirements, and so that you can measure fit. And then probably the most important part of an assessment is to help the hiring team understand where they need to probe deeper in subsequent interviews. By far, that is the most, you are as concerned about the good parts that come back out of the assessment as much as those areas where there isn't a fit that need deeper understanding.
And the fit can be relative to the job, it can be relative to the team, it can be relative to the hiring manager. Because of how long we've been doing this, we each have a pretty good self-awareness of tolerance levels for certain things. John cannot tolerate, well, someone with a very low critical thinking ability. It's not going to end well. He just knows he doesn't have patience for that. I don't have any patience for low personal accountability. So as soon as I hear excuses, blaming everything under the sun, the traffic, the weather, the whatever, when it's used as an excuse for not getting stuff done, it's like nails on a chalkboard for me. So those are things we screen out for early, like in the phone screen before anybody's even gone a step further. Those are things that you'll get to know a little bit more. But the amount of time you want to track how much time you're spending in that, and that your process should act like a funnel. and you should have the greatest number of people at the top, and you're whittling them down towards the end. The assessments come somewhere in the middle, and you're going to continue to whittle down. If you are taking every person all the way through every step in the process, this is just an exercise in futility. So it should help the hiring team, as John say, feel more empowered to make better decisions faster.
One of the more popular hiring instruments is Predictive Index. And we get asked almost every day what we think about Predictive Index and how does it compare with other instruments. And one of the reasons it's so popular is it had been purchased recently by a very large organization with a lot of marketing money and a lot of resources, and it's made its way into a lot of different organizations. When you are considering different types of assessments, lay them out side by side so that you can compare the pros and cons of each. There aren't always any real clear cuts. For instance, when we were looking at Predictive Index, and remember, at one time we sold Predictive Index.
Yes.
It was one of
it was the first assessment we used.
but it's changed. So if you're looking for some of the things that you want to look for is how fast and scalable it can be. You want to look at whether or not it is going to be used for leaders or entry-level people, how easy it is for an organization to understand it and use it, how well it kind of measures up the whole person, whether or not there's any kind of learning or ramp up that is needed. And then another, how well is it for evaluating a candidate's ability to make decisions? We went through and we compared Predictive Index to what we give, and in some cases, Predictive Index is a better instrument. In some cases, our ECR is a better instrument.
And we should tell you the ECR, the secret to the acronym, is External Candidate Review, which for us includes the Trimetrics by TTI and the Watson-Glaser.
The graph that we looked at
yes.
earlier. But anyway.
But this one is probably both because we also use the critical thinking test by Watson-Glaser, which is pretty amazing. But there are differences for different roles and for different organizations that you need to consider. So you might be content with the Predictive Index. At some point, you might realize, oh my gosh, this isn't enough, or I feel confused, I feel like I'm getting conflicting results, and you're really not, you're just missing a piece of the puzzle. So case study, OMB is, Old Mecklenburg Brewery is one of our absolute favorite clients, also favorite beers in the Charlotte area if you're ever here. They are fanatical about their culture. And as they were contemplating expanding into a second location, John Marino, who is the CEO, wanted to make sure that the culture wasn't disrupted or diluted when they were going to move this over. So we really wanted to understand that. And we did a deep dive in there. We took some of their very best servers and we looked at their behaviors and motivators, and we looked at, and we actually had one of our experts observe what was going on. And we realized some things that were very unique to OMB that may not be true in all serving environments. If any of you are familiar with the way microbreweries work, when you go in there, every microbrewery has a different name for their beers. You can't go to OMB and ask for a Coors Light. You can't go to one of the other local breweries and ask for OMBs. So you rely on the server to say, you know, I kind of like a beer that does XYZ or that isn't this. So we found that if the servers had an incredible high theoretical that made them just super geek, oh, then you should try this beer because we make it like this, and they get all fired up about telling you about the whole process used in their brew house and excite people about it. The difference between a good server and a great server was when this high theoretical was in the #1 position. It was crazy. And we would have never seen that coming. That's not common in serving roles. We also needed to see a lot of multitasking and really great with people. It is a very friendly, family-friendly, dog-friendly environment, especially if you're out in the beer garden. One of the other things that we realized is one of the motivators that tells us that somebody likes to be in control of their own destiny and that of others often is seen that with a drive for capitalism. So being able to control their own destiny by getting better tips is usually very good for servers. Not at OMB. They do team serving. So high individualistics, those people like to control their own destiny, did not like serving as part of a group and having to share tips with the guy next to him. So having that in a very low position made an enormous difference in understanding what was going on and creating a culture there that was just phenomenal and distinctive from any of the other places.
Yeah, we often get asked what level of position should organizations consider assessments for? And these are servers. This is very, very entry level. But they understood that the assessment could help them determine the best job fit for the best customer experience, and are using a multi-science assessment to allow them to evaluate their servers. Now, this isn't a very long assessment that they have, because these particular candidates need to be assessed quickly, but it is a part of their hiring process.
And because we understood, once we understood what the critical aspects were, the hiring teams, hiring managers could be handed the questions that would zero in on those characteristics. So in the first phone screen or two, those people who weren't good fits were bounced out and they never even bothered getting to the assessment phase, because the hiring managers got just so good at understanding, because they understood why those things were important, not just that they were important.
So that's it.
Ingrid, what do we have?
do we
This
have
is the, if you like QR codes better, but the link is also put into the chat for
Right.
you.
So go ahead and use that to get your
Hiring
checklist.
process checklist, and to give us some feedback. And Ingrid, do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, someone said they wonder what the magic potion is when hiring globally. Their company is US based. Most of their workforce is being sourced from a few other countries. Any advice for me in terms of this?
Yeah, so really good question around hiring globally, and is there a secret sauce? It is a US-based company. We do occasionally get this question. Most of our clients have a US presence, but they may have some locations in other places. A lot has to do with the culture. If you are expecting people to work in the US, on US soil, in an English-speaking environment under your culture, then doing it based on that culture works fine. If you have a location in Germany or one in India, we're talking very different cultures, generally speaking, and we would define what's needed in the jobs in those cultures. If you're okay having a slightly different culture in each of those locations than your home office here, but there generally isn't a one size fits all when you start crossing country borders.
The other thing to keep in mind, we get asked often, what language should the assessment be taken in? And most assessments will be offered up in multiple languages. We recommend, if whatever the predominant language is within the organization and how the individuals are going to be interacting with others within the organization, whatever language that is, we would recommend that be the language that you would assess in. If it doesn't matter and you're just looking for them to complete the assessment, so because there may be an individual contributor or something like that, then by all means assess in the language that they're most comfortable with.
We had one client who brought in somebody who had been English speaking much of their life. English was a second language, but they had only been in the United States for about a year and did not do well on the assessments at all. And we gave them a lot of follow-up questions because things on the resumes made them drool, right? And so when they went back in, and I said, keep in mind, they're going to be working for an American supervisor who's going to be using expressions. These assessments are typically written at third grade level. So you shouldn't have language barrier. And this person didn't have an English barrier, but there were cultural issues. And that was, we finally realized when they were asking the follow-up questions that this was going to be an impediment to their success in that organization. Ingrid, any other questions?
Giving candidates results.
Giving candidates results. This gets a little tricky. If you have just behavioral assessments, it's not hard to give them the results because they're pretty self-explanatory. Once you start using multiple sciences, you're now asking someone to not only understand each science, but to understand how it comes together as a whole. So you wind up having to have an expert debrief. And this becomes a large investment of time and effort. One of our senior advisors debriefing a hiring manager could easily take an hour, so a candidate would easily take that long, and the organization would have to compensate for that. Most organizations do not really want to do that unless it's an internal candidate. So if it's an internal candidate, we strongly recommend, once the hiring decision is made, to make sure everybody internally who is part of the process be debriefed on their assessment results, help them understand opportunities for development, because remember, none of us are perfect, and how they could prepare for whatever their next role might be in the organization. But generally speaking, new hires are always debriefed on their assessments relative to the role, so they can understand, we know you're not perfect and that's okay, but here's where you're going to have to commit to some development. But candidates are generally not debriefed, and most don't really expect to be.
Yeah, if you do have an external candidate who is insistent on being debriefed on their results, what we have recommended is that candidate can invest in the professional
Coaching session.
debrief on their own. So
And of all the times we've offered
there's
this,
been one candidate
one.
who's made that investment. It was almost $1,000 that they had invested to have their results debriefed to
It
them.
was about 25 years ago. It
but-
still has to
so
come with the permission of the
that-
hiring manager.
And that's assuming, yeah, that the hiring team is okay sharing that.
Mhm.
But if you do have a candidate who's insistent, allow them to see the results if they're willing to pay for the debrief.
Anything else?
Know that you need multi-science assessments.
When do you know that you need multi-science assessments? There'll be a time, sometimes you'll decide that a single science behavioral assessments alone are just what we need for now. At some point, you'll feel like it's not enough. I'm not getting the whole picture. Gosh, we made a couple of bad hiring decisions anyway. Why was that? And you're going to realize that either or both your selection process needs to change, or that you need to use multiple tools, or that it needs to be interpreted by an expert. When you think about your doctor, who's pretty accomplished, your primary care physician, can read the thermometer, they can read the blood tests, but they're still asking for a radiologist to interpret your x-rays, and they're asking for expert expertise in an MRI. Even those folks, when you're using more and more sophisticated tools, you may need a debrief, but you begin to realize the greater insight, the greater information it can give you to make much more powerful decisions. Sometimes we recommend that clients who are wondering that to run the two assessments parallel for a while. Run the one you're running, run the ECR for a little bit. We've had clients that have been with us forever start off that way and then realize this was everything that they could hope for. So appreciate all of that. We are on the 39-minute mark. So coming up May 20th, the greatest leadership gift is on 360s. 360 is getting feedback from others around you, peers, direct reports, boss, yourself, in understanding how you're perceived versus your intention of how you want to lead. June 17th, emotional intelligence for high potentials. If you don't know a lot about emotional intelligence in the workplace, it's fascinating how it can be a differentiator. Leadership essentials, not just basics, it's both for new leaders as well as seasoned leaders who just never were given some foundational pieces. And then a performance acceleration tracker, how to turn a job scorecard into a way to actually accelerate performance and track progress and push it even further.
So we thank you all for attending today. You'll be getting an email shortly with the ability to download the slides, as well as a recording of the session, and then some other resources that are part of the hiring process as well. So hope to see you next week, or next month rather, and have a great rest of the week.
Take care.